as freely as they used to be. So that would be one kind of symptom you might look for. Obviously, if there's any visible cracks or deterioration that have shown up since the implosion took place, that's something to be investigated. But yeah, that's the most I can say is, maybe walk your property. If you're particularly concerned about anything like that, you want to maybe get in touch with the structural engineer who can come take a look around, and just make sure that any of those surrounding buildings were not negatively impacted by that. But usually I think they're pretty precise and pretty strategic about how they demolish an older building like that. So I guess we'll see.
What does the lack of you mentioned it's hard to open doors and windows. What does that point to for those who are not educated
Yeah. So
in this?
imagine if you've got a window frame that is perfectly square when it's built, and if there's any sort of tilting or shifting of the structure, right? It might just be a fraction of an inch shifted over, but now that window that was designed to be perfectly square is now sliding into an enclosure that has been deformed to a certain extent. So that is one of the things that we look for and talk to our clients about. If you've got doors that are scraping along the ground where they didn't used to, or windows and doors that don't open and slide freely, not just because the track might be corroded or have some debris in it, but physically the framework of that might now be compromised. That's an indication, especially if you see that as kind of a pattern around the property. If you've got a whole stack of units that are all experiencing the same thing, then you can say, okay, maybe something has now affected the vertical structure of the building. So that's just a really quick, simple one that you might look for, is anything that doesn't operate the way that it used to prior to the implosion.
Awesome. And if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and share them in the chat. We can answer them as we go or whenever Will is ready.
Yeah, I mean, so far we've got, a fairly small group, so I'm kind of okay with answering questions on the fly. Once we get started, I've got about 40 slides or so to go through, and I want to try to keep us on time. So I may save some questions for the end for the Q&A, especially if I know that it's a question that will be answered as we go along. So, yeah, I mean, I think just, in terms of other housekeeping, Abby, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe we are live recording now and also live streaming to YouTube. So we'll be able to make
Correct.
this available to anybody after the fact. I'm happy to send out copies of the slides as well. So if there's anybody that wants to get a written, copy of everything that I'm sharing on the screen, I'd be happy to do that. The class is also approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So if any of you guys are licensed CAMs attending today, I'm not sure if that would have been something you had to provide when you registered. If not, then you can always email me with your CAM license number, and we'll make sure that everybody gets credit for that. So, all right, I think, Abby, what do you think? We're 5 minutes after the top of the hour. Do you want to say anything before we get going?
No, I just want to say thank you for your time. For those of you that don't know, Will has conducted over, let me go with my camera live. Will has conducted over 100,000 case studies. There's a lot of wisdom to be shared when someone has conducted so many.
Let me qualify. My company in our 40-year
Okay.
history has done it, but I can claim about 5,000 of those under my
That
belt.
is a
Yeah.
tremendous amount of knowledge to be shared with one company. So we find it very valuable that you're willing to share that knowledge with us. So we're very grateful for that. And we're all ears listening to what you have to say to us here today. We're grateful for your time. And like we mentioned, we're live streaming on YouTube, and we will continue to circulate this for those who aren't able to immediately join. We will circulate it on YouTube as well. So thank you, Will. The floor is completely yours. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, Abby, and thanks to the Brickell Homeowners Association. We've been a member of BHA now for at least the last couple of years, and this is very, important for us. We have dealt with a lot of the condo buildings in Brickell. I used to live in Brickell when I first moved to Miami. That's where my wife and I lived, so know the neighborhood very well. It's been just an amazing amount of growth that we've seen there in the last certainly the last 5 to 10 years or so. So let me just start with kind of a brief intro. As I mentioned, this course is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit. I've been teaching this class, Fundamentals of Reserves, off and on for, I think, probably 15 plus years now. The course materials kind of evolved a little bit. Some of what I'm going to talk about today is very specifically about the SIRS requirements, the Structural Integrity Reserve Study requirements, which of course are going to be very relevant for almost all of the buildings in Brickell, if not every one of them. So let me kind of dive into that a little bit more. I'm going to turn my camera off just so I'm not seeing my own face talking here. I'll come back on screen later on at the end of the course session today, but I'm going to kick things off now. So here we go. So yeah, as I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for our company, which is called Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008, just over 18 years for me now. As I mentioned, in that time, I've completed and overseen more than 5,000 reserve studies. The RS that you see there after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That is an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. That comes from CAI, Community Associations Institute. For those of you out there who are not familiar, the Southeast Florida chapter of CAI is great. It's one of the biggest ones in the country. If you're not familiar, as a board member, a manager, a building, a professional, there's various types of membership with CAI, and we highly recommend checking them out. I always like to highlight I'm not an attorney, so don't take anything I say today as specific legal advice. I will be touching on some of the legislative requirements and talking about how buildings can comply with those. But if you're unsure about anything I've said, you definitely want to double check that with your own legal counsel. There may be something in your building's governing documents, for example, that may be somewhat unique. So if you're not familiar with us, again, we are the oldest and largest reserve study company in the United States. So we work with a lot of different types of properties, not just condos and HOAs. But as you see here, we also do with private schools and church facilities, a lot of large scale kind of master plan developments. You guys, I'm sure, will recognize Fisher Island here. The Fisher Island Community Association has been a long-term client of ours for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years now. We also work, of course, with lots of high-rise condos. That's going to be, I think, most relevant for you all here today. We also work with golf courses, country clubs, resorts, vacation ownership type properties. So we go far beyond just working with associations. All right. Speak a little bit about our Florida staff in particular. Our company as a whole, we've been in business since 1986. We've completed, at this point, like we said, over 100,000 reserve studies. Our Florida office is the largest one that we have in the United States, including myself. We have a total of 21 people on our Florida staff. We have a very wide variety of technical backgrounds, a lot of folks with engineering degrees, but also architecture, construction management, business, accounting. As of now, I believe it's 8 of us have currently earned the Reserve Specialist credential. We've got a few more folks in the pipeline that will be applying for their RS here in the next year or two. Last thing I'll say on this slide, we've been very fortunate to be recognized as a Reader's Choice Award winner for the last 13 years in a row by the Florida Community Association Journal. So for those of you guys who have supported us and voted for us over the years, I always want to say thank you for that. We really appreciate it. If you'd like any other background information, you can visit our website. It's reservestudy.com, or you can shoot me an email anytime. I will have my email address up on the screen later, but if you want to write it down now, that's wsimons, WSIMONS, at reservestudy.com. All right, quick overview of what I'm going to cover in the next 45, 50 minutes. The first 2 segments I think are going to go by fairly quickly, but it's always good to begin with the basic stuff. What are reserves? How do we compare reserve money to operating money? I'm going to spend some more time talking about reserve studies and kind of how these tools are used by associations. Beyond that, the last, I should say the third and fourth segments of the course here today, going to be reviewing the existing SIRS requirements, which go back now to 2022. And then kind of zeroing in, talking about what changed last summer with House Bill 913. And then at the end, as I said, we'll open it up to Q&A. So at any point along the way, if you guys want to use the Zoom Q&A taskbar, you can certainly ask a question there, and I will address those either on the fly as I see them come in, or if it makes more sense to kind of hold that till the end, we'll do that. So first basic question, what are reserves? So, for those of you who have been managers for a while, or if you're a board member who's been involved with the budgeting process, this is going to be very basic. But if you're not familiar with this, or if you're, kind of new to the condo world, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about these two main aspects of any given association's budget. Okay, so the first section is what we call the operating fund. Now, the operating money is essentially there for the routine costs that all associations face, right? These are the daily, weekly, monthly things that you have to do to keep the lights on and kind of run the business of the association. So think of these like utilities, insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, kind of the routine day-to-day stuff. So sometimes we draw a comparison here. If you want to think of operating funds in kind of personal finance terms, the operating account is how you might use your personal checking account. Okay. Operating money is unrestricted. So that means that you can spend that money on any bill the association has to pay. Typically, you will spend that money in the same year that you've collected it. So what that means is that if you've designed a very good budget, hopefully you don't have much of a surplus or a deficit at the end of the year. And basically you spend all of the operating money that you've collected within the same fiscal year during that same time frame. Now, on the other hand, you've got reserve funds. Now, reserve accounts are there for the long-term expenses that associations have to pay for. Now, sometimes these things may not occur for 5 or 10 or 25 years at a time, but when they do, they might be some of the biggest bills the association will ever have to pay. So your reserve funds are typically going to be used for things like roof replacements, painting and waterproofing, pavement, elevators, major HVAC systems, things like that. Some of the other differences between operating and reserve money is that reserve funds are restricted. So that means once you've put $1 into a reserve account, it can now only be spent on specific things, not on any just random costs that you have to pay for. Another key difference, again, in contrast to the operating fund, reserve money does accumulate, sometimes for many, many years, could be decades, building up an account balance until you need to spend that for its intended purpose. So going back to our analogy, in that way, the reserve account functions more like a specialty savings account for an individual or family. Okay. All right. Let's go to the next one. There we go. So on this slide here, this is a very short excerpt from Florida statute, specifically statute 718. This is the condo statute. So this applies to all condominiums within the state. And what I've highlighted in red here, this is the portion of the statute that talks about what associations should be or must be reserving for. So if you look at that section, you'll see the statute requires that condo associations reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in a kind of broad general definition at the end. So the 3 things they name specifically are the roof, painting, and pavement. And then that general definition is for any other item with a replacement cost greater than $25,000. Now, it used to be $10,000. As you see, we've kind of crossed that out, but this is something that changed just within the last year. So nowadays, anything that is 25,000 and above is mandatory to be in your proposed budget. Items less than that could be excluded, but we're going to talk about that, about why that may not be such a good idea. Okay, I don't know how relevant this will be, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it today. This is the statute 720, which is for HOAs, for single family home communities. The difference here is that I want to just point out there is nothing in the HOA statute, no sort of checklist defining what you have to reserve for. There is no criteria there. It just says that, your association is responsible for the repair and maintenance of capital improvements, and that could result in a special assessment if your reserves are not there. So good news, one of the things we're going to talk about today, there's a much more realistic and thorough way to go about defining what any association of any size should be including in its reserve plan. So we'll cover that here shortly. For now, I want to keep this basic definition kind of front of mind. Reserve money is there for an association to save over long periods of time for major repairs and replacements. Okay, so take a moment to notice what I did not say. Okay, I did not say that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements or paying a insurance deductible or really for any other purpose. That's not what it's intended for. So let me give you an example. Let's say there's an association that does not have a playground, but all of the residents get together and say, look, we've got the space for it. We've got lots of kids and grandkids running around. We'd like to put this in as a new feature, a new amenity. Now, that might be a very good idea. It might be a worthwhile thing and could add value to the property, but they shouldn't be reusing reserve money for that. The reason is they are adding a new element to that community, which would have never been considered in any of their prior years' reserve budgets. So that means any existing reserve money that they collected was done so without the anticipation of this new cost, right? It was all there for the existing things they already had. So if they want to put in a new playground, they can, but the initial expenditure, the construction of that should be funded some other way, right? That could be a loan or a special assessment or just a surplus in the operating budget. But the point is, it should not be a reserve item because you're creating something that wasn't there before. Now, once they did that, let's say they went ahead anyways, then the association could start reserving for the eventual long-term repairs and upgrades and renovations of the playground. It's just that initial cost of putting it there in the first place that is not really a reserve expense. Okay, like I said, that first portion, very short and elementary. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about reserve studies and how these are used by associations during their annual budgeting process. So the first thing we're going to do is just establish the definition of this term. So the definition of a reserve study comes from National Reserve Study Standards. These standards have been in place now for actually close to 30 years, again, coming from CAI, and basically say that a reserve study is a tool or a document that does a couple of important things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And then secondly, it provides a funding plan that gives guidance about how to deal with future expenditures. So again, notice what I didn't say. Okay, a reserve study is not an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study. It's not a just kind of generic engineering report, right? It is a very particular document that contains some very specific content regarding the physical and financial elements of the community. Right, there are two parts to any reserve study. The first part is what we call the physical analysis, and then there's the financial analysis. So the physical analysis part of the job is where somebody like me comes out to do an on-site visual inspection of all of the common areas of the property. So we're looking at everything from the top to the bottom, the roof to the mechanical rooms to the amenity areas, the hallways, the lobby, basically anything and everything that the association is responsible for needs to be evaluated. Now, this process is very kind of detailed and painstaking. We take a lot of measurements and photos, but we're also doing things like gathering model numbers and serial numbers off of equipment, basically doing whatever we need to do to gather up the raw data related to each of those components, which will eventually be used to determine their life expectancies and their replacement cost. So when we do this first part, this physical analysis, where we're coming out to inspect the property, it's usually very worthwhile to meet with a representative, right? That can be a board member, a manager, a both, engineering supervisor. The idea is we want to try and collaborate with and get input from the representatives of the property because they have the insight and the experience of living there, of working there. They know what the concerns are. Maybe they've got some, inside knowledge about, mechanical components that have been breaking down, right? So my point is that if you're commissioning somebody to have a reserve study done, don't assume that you can just kind of sit back and wait for the results. It's going to be in your best interest to be involved with that process. Now, the second part of what we do is the financial analysis. And this is everything that takes place after the inspection, where we organize and kind of consolidate all that raw data that we got from the inspection, and we start analyzing it, right? We're going to research particular costs and project history. We're going to compare that information against our experience working with similar properties. And basically just fill in the gaps, right? Find out when things were last done. What are the concerns here? Are there any estimates you've collected for things? We put all that together and begin to draw some financial conclusions. So speaking of those, there are basically three outcomes to a reserve study, which we'll talk about one by one. The first outcome of this process is this establishment of what we call the component list. Now, basically, this is just a list of each individual item or asset that is the responsibility of the association, along with the values for life expectancy and replacement cost. This is going to be the tool that we use to then create the timeline of future expenditures. Okay. Now, nationally, there are industry standard definitions that define what a reserve component should be. And of course, like we showed a few slides ago here in Florida, we also have some specific criteria that we need to be mindful of, particularly when we get into a structural integrity study. I'm going to cover that in more detail as we go forward. But just to let you know that nationally speaking, there are these kind of industry standard criteria, these definitions of what belongs on this component list. Okay, once we've defined that list and used it to create your timeline of future expenses, typically that timeline is going to go out most often about 30 years. The next thing we're going to do is look at the present day and evaluate how much money is in the bank now compared to how much money there should be given those future expenditures, right? Think of it like a long-term roadmap, right? If we're figuring out a driving distance, one of the first things we want to know is how much gas do we have in the tank, right? Are we going to need to increase that along the way? Very similar to what we do in a reserve study at this stage. The most common metric for doing this, for evaluating that reserve fund strength, is a metric that we call percent funded. Okay, one of the best ways that we found to explain percent funded is to compare it to something like a credit score. Okay, so everybody I'm sure on this call today has had your credit report pulled and you have some idea generally of what your credit score is. And I'm sure you understand that to an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, that score is an indicator, right? It tells them what kind of risk you might be. So in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself as something like a credit report for a building, but you have to distill it down to one key result, then I would say percent funded is that result. Now we measure it on this 0 to 100% scale. We consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. What we mean by that is that in that range, associations have a much higher likelihood of special assessments and other types of cash flow problems. Once you get into this sort of middle band here, 30 to 70% funded, we consider that to be a fair range, more of a moderate risk. Okay, it's not an emergency anymore, but there's still room for improvement here. Where you really want to be is above 70% funded. Anything above 70% is considered strong, much lower likelihood of special assessments or loans or kind of cash flow problems. Of course, 100% funded is kind of the center of the bullseye there, but 70% and above is generally considered to be a strong position. All right, so that is percent funded kind of as a concept. I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we calculate that number. It's a fairly simple idea. Basically, all we're doing here is looking at how much money you have, right? How much money does the association have? Comparing that amount against how much money it should have at the same point in time and expressing that as a percentage. Okay, so conceptually, how much money do you have divided by or compared against how much you should as a percentage is percent funded. So the bottom number there is what we call the fully funded balance, that amount of how much you should have. Okay, so the way that I like to put this in perspective, because this is a theoretical number, is to frame it as a question, right? So if I told you that there's some association out there that has $50,000 in reserves, but I haven't told you anything else about that community, is that meaningful? Have I really told you anything at all? Now we'll hear this kind of thing all the time from some of our clients. They'll say to us, for example, I think we're doing really well. Our association's good. We've got a nice balance sheet. We have, $900,000 in reserves. Okay, great. But I don't know if that's sufficient or not until I have something to compare it against. And that is this number that we call the fully funded balance. Okay, so if I were to tell you that my association has 50 grand in reserves, but I haven't told you where it is, where it's located, what kind of amenities we have, right? That's all meaningless information. And this is really the act that we need to do in a reserve study, is to create or calculate that number. Let me actually go back to this for a second. Let me just explain this with kind of a very basic example. Let's say we're talking about a golf cart, okay? Let's say it's a very nice golf cart that costs $10,000. And let's say it has a life expectancy of 10 years. At any point in the life of that golf cart, I can stop and say, well, how much money should we have for this eventual replacement cost? Because we want to see how well we're doing, right? So if it's $10,000 and 10 years of life, and we'll ignore inflation for the moment, that means the association has to put away about $1,000 a year so that at the end of 10 years, they have enough money to buy a new one. So let's say that the golf cart is 4 years old. Okay, it's 4/10 of the way through its lifespan. At that point, they should have $4,000 set aside, right? 4 years at $1,000 a year equals 4,000. So the fully funded balance at that point in time is $4,000. Now, if I ask the client, well, how much money do you actually have set aside? And they say $2,000. Well, 2/4, they are 50% funded. And their practical takeaway there would be, okay, we need to increase our contributions to reserves because we're a little bit behind, right? By the end of the life of this thing, we want to have the full cost set aside. So we need to accelerate our contributions over these next 6 years or so that we are fully prepared to do this. Okay, so when we do this kind of on a large scale for a whole association, that's all we're doing is we're looking at the individual lifespan and cost of each item, doing the math, calculating where it's at in the kind of overall life of the asset. That gives us a fraction. Take that fraction, multiply by its replacement cost, and arrive at a theoretical fully funded balance for each thing. When we add all those numbers together, that is how we determine in total how much that association should have in the bank. Okay. Now, once we've done that, right, we've established the component list and we have established our kind of starting position, our percent funded. The next thing we need to do is figure out, where do they go from here? What is the ongoing funding plan going to be to either maintain or improve their financial position? Right. So again, sometimes I'll frame it as, the component list is what you have. That's just the physical reality of the property. The percent funded number, that evaluation of current reserve fund strength, tells us how well you're doing today. But the third question to answer, which is the funding plan, where do we go from here? Okay, so when we design a funding plan for any of our clients, we're kind of doing a balancing act of these kind of key principles. So first and foremost, when you are designing a reserve funding plan, right, we're modeling expenditures out over 30 years based on how much money they have in the bank now. At the very least, we have to show that this association will not run out of money at some point in the future. So what we hear say, sufficient cash must be available, never going below zero. That's something that we call baseline funding. So that's what the minimum requirement is in the state of Florida, is that you need to demonstrate that your funding of this reserve account will make sure that you never run out of money at some point in the future. Otherwise, you're doomed and you will definitely have a special assessment, which is kind of the key thing we're trying to avoid. Your reserve funds are distributed amongst all of your components. So what this typically means is that you don't take years off, right? Even if you've just, let's say, modernized an elevator, you don't stop funding for elevators in your annual budget. It just means you've started the clock over again. And the earliest and best time to start saving is immediately when the thing is brand new. That way you're spreading the total cost of the replacement over all of the people who will come and go throughout that property and get all the use and value of those assets. Okay, so you're distributing your reserve contribution across the whole spectrum of your entire component list. You want your contributions to be stable. That means that you should not have major spikes or drop-offs in the funding rate. It's perfectly healthy and normal to have some kind of annual inflationary increase, something like 2 or 3% each year, meaning that you are always increasing your budget line item for reserves. Because the reality is, folks, that's what's happening on the expenditure side. Everything tends to get more expensive every year. 3% is a very good average to assume. So your reserve contributions should be keeping up with that. Now, lastly, we want that funding plan to be fiscally responsible. So being realistic when it comes to interest earnings, to whatever the inflation rate is going to be, making sure that you are not prioritizing the present ownership at the expense of the future owners, right? You can't just plug in some massive increase 10 years from now, right before the roof gets replaced, and just say, well, that's not our problem. That'll be for those people to deal with at that point in time. That's actually prohibited in Florida administrative code. That's called a balloon payment. You can't do that. So as you're designing your funding plan, whether that's with a reserve study, provider's help or not, always got to be focusing on being fiscally responsible. All right. Trying to keep us on time here. We're about halfway through the hour. So we're going to shift now into talking about the SERS requirements. Okay. So by now, this should be old news, but there are some things that have changed within the last couple of years. So this is why we're going to go through kind of the quick review of how we got to this point. Then I'll talk about what has changed most recently, and we'll dive into this. So let me go forward now and kind of just talk about the history of the legislation. So I'm sure everybody remembers now, it's almost 5 years ago now, the tragic collapse, Champlain Towers South and Surfside. 98 people lost their lives. It turns into $1 billion legal claim. And within, the weeks and months following that, you started to see the legislative response forming. Ultimately, that resulted in the spring of 2022 with Senate Bill 4D. So that was the first time the Florida legislature, introduced the concept of what we now call a structural integrity reserve study, which we often abbreviate as SIRS. Okay, now the biggest changes to that initial bill took place in 2023, Senate Bill 154. So those of you who remember the original bill, you might recall that they had some things in there like foundations of buildings that were named as a reserve component. I think a lot of people scratched their heads at that and said, well, that's not really a practical thing to reserve for. So the year that transpired from 22 to 23, a lot of people kind of trimmed down the requirements, got rid of the things that didn't make sense to include there. This is also when the types of providers of SIRS were expanded to include reserve specialists and professional reserve analysts. So really in 2023 is when the initial kind of wave of demand and completions began to take place across the state. That carried us through into 2024. Nothing major changed in 2024 with House Bill 1021. We did have some additional reporting requirements and new educational requirements for board members, but no major difference or change with regard to the SIRS requirement. Now, fast forward to last year. Last year, House Bill 913 passed the legislature in the spring, was signed into law effective July 1st. I guess you could say we fast forward to now, we have completed the legislative session for 2026 and nothing still has changed. So as of right now, House Bill 913 is the most recent kind of iteration of this legislation. All right, so for those who are not familiar or want to refresh on what is a SIRS, this is the section of the text here that kind of just spells that out. So again, I'll make these slides available to anybody who wants them, but if you want to read that over, please do. I guess my point here is if you take out the words structural and integrity from this definition, what you're left with is basically the classic definition of a reserve study. It's a physical analysis of a property based on a visual inspection by a qualified professional that is then used to create a financial analysis that property will use to make sure it is forecasting and budgeting for those major projects. Okay, so there's a lot more words on the screen here, but this is something we've already covered in this class today. What is a reserve study? Well, a SIRS is just kind of a new wrinkle on that old concept. Now, what is kind of specific and unique to a SIRS is that it is limited only to certain elements of the property. So nowadays, what most buildings are doing is obtaining two documents. They will have a SERS, which is for everything you see on the screen here, and then a non-structural or a traditional or a general reserve study, which are still going to be funding for things like, elevators and interior amenities and things like that, but those items not that are otherwise not listed here. Okay, so in a SERS, you're looking specifically at the structural critical elements of the property. So it's the roof, the structure, which includes load-bearing walls and primary structural members, fireproofing and fire protection, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows and exterior doors, but I'll put an asterisk on that to say only the ones that are the association's responsibility. Okay, so just in case anybody's panicking right now saying, well, our SERS doesn't include every window and door of the property, that's okay. If your governing documents say that the owner is responsible for their unit and that unit includes the windows and doors, that shifts the responsibility to the individual owner. Okay, and then there's this item H here, which is any other item with a deferred maintenance expense or cost exceeding $25,000, and the failure to replace or maintain that thing negatively affects something else on this list. All right, so I'll give you a typical example of that would be something like the balcony railings on a balcony, right? The either aluminum or metal and glass enclosures you have on your balcony. Those are attached to the structure of the building, right? They're bolted into the slab. And if they are not maintained, right? If you get, some water intrusion around the posts of those railings that starts to eat away at the concrete structure of the balcony, by that definition, the railings themselves have now also become a structural item. Okay, so it's a little bit of a logical test you have to apply there, but if you've got something that is very expensive, 25 grand or more, and if it could compromise something else on this list, by that definition, it belongs in your SERS. Okay, otherwise, most of the original requirements have not changed. We're still talking about properties throughout the whole state, specifically condos and co-ops that are 3 or more stories in height. There are a couple of exemptions there. If your buildings are, I believe it's 4 units or less per building, they are not required to get a SERS done. Okay, but that's kind of a small exception. The SERS still must be based on a visual inspection, and once that's completed, that document must be reported to the DBPR and provided to the members within 45 days. All of that was in effect as of 2024. Okay. All right, so that was a quick, recap of how we got to this point, but let me talk now about what has changed within the last year. I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly, but I do want to highlight something. Down at the bottom of the screen where you see sourced here, this is the actual bill text, the page number and the line numbers that I use to source this information. When I send out the copy of the slides or when Abby does that on my behalf, I'll give her a copy of the complete bill text. So if you really want to go deep and do your homework on this, I'm going to tell you exactly where you can find the justification for everything I'm about to say. All right. Try to make that easier for you guys. This is the whole bill is about 191 pages long. Very boring legalese, but I did the shortcuts for you here. So first thing to highlight is that the deadline for obtaining the SERS, which was originally December 31st of 2024, got extended last July to December 31st, 25, which is also, of course, now passed. So if any of you guys out there have not gotten your SERS done and reported it to the DBPR, you are in violation of Florida statute. So don't wait. There is going to be more enforcement of this coming along, which is something I'm going to talk about towards the end here. Just the history on this is kind of interesting. When they first created that requirement of December 31st, 24, I think that was a very ambitious goal considering how many condos there are in Florida. Okay. The reality is that when they first published the data, the amount of properties that met the original deadline, December 24, was maybe a quarter to a third of condos and co-ops in the state. So I think naturally there was going to be some need to extend that, which they did last year. As of now, when I just recently looked at this a few weeks ago, it seems to be no more than half of the buildings in Florida have completed it. So I don't know what that means, if they may continue to extend the deadline, but I know that the legislature was pretty adamant that they were not in favor of doing that. It's going to be more of an enforcement practice to get people into compliance as soon as possible or subject them to penalties. All right, come back to that in a moment. Some of the other details here that changed. This is kind of a subtle but important one. Originally, the text here said that any person qualified could prepare a SIRS as long as the visual inspection of the building was performed or verified by an engineer, architect, reserve specialist, or a professional reserve analyst, a PRA. In last year's bill, I should say, they got rid of this part. So now the only people that can do a SIRS would be one of these four types of professionals here. I don't think this happened very much over the last couple of years, but I know there were at least a few instances where you might have had somebody like an accountant or a property manager trying their best to prepare a SIRS, maybe working with an engineer who's doing the visual inspection, but the state has taken that option away now. Okay. It now must be the whole thing is done by one of these four types. All right. Another big change that went into effect with the legislation last year was the addition of some new language, which was intended to require transparency and also prevent conflicts of interest. So to be specific, this now means that design professionals, such as engineers and architects, who might have some other interest in a property, maybe that means bidding on a contract for concrete restoration or painting or project management fees, they have to disclose that in writing before they submit a proposal for a SIRS. Okay, that doesn't mean it's illegal for them to do both, but they have to disclose that to the association. I know this one is the specific result of some kind of unfortunate circumstances where you had a provider of a SIRS for a building, completing that study, which meant providing opinions on conditions of the property and kind of outlining what needed to be done, and then changing hats really quick and saying, okay, well, now we can also be the ones to oversee these repairs for you. I think there were some anecdotal stories of some providers using a fairly low cost SIRS engagement as the springboard to maybe some project management type fees that might have been worth many times that. So that is now being limited here. There has to be that disclosure of the intention to bid. All right, I can tell you from having spoken with a lot of the legislators that the most recent focus was really on financial flexibility, on easing the burden of costs to people in these buildings by making these things a little bit more flexible. Okay, so even if you haven't felt it yourself, I'm sure many of you guys out there have at least heard of the anxiety or the frustration about making these big budgetary increases in what people felt was a very short amount of time. So here's what they did to fix that. Okay, as we say on the screen here, now loans, lines of credit, and special assessments can be incorporated into a SIRS and treated as part of the funding plan. But there is a specific detail or caveat there. The funding from those sources has to be immediately available to the board without further approval of the members. So for example, that doesn't mean that a board could say, look, a year from now, we plan on taking out a loan for a project. That won't fly. Unless it has already been done, right? The loan is approved, those funds are available. Now that could be incorporated into the SIRS. But if they have not done that, right, or if they have not passed the special assessment, then the provider of the SIRS cannot take that into account, right? Only if the funding is available to the board that somebody like me can say, okay, you've got a $10 million loan. You're going to use those loan funds to pay for all these things around the property. We're going to go ahead and reset the life expectancies on all these components to show that you're only reserving for them into the future, not for this immediate cost because you're going to pay for that with some other method. Okay. Here's another one that is very important. There's a lot of text here on the screen. So again, encourage you to read over on your own time. But the short summary of this is that if you are in a property that has completed a milestone inspection within the last 2 years, and that milestone inspection uncovered substantial repairs that need to be dealt with right away, you can now actually pause your reserve funding for the next 2 budgets. Now, that will only apply to budgets adopted before the end of 2028, but that might be a nice sense of relief for some properties that got a milestone done and discovered, oh boy, we've got, tons of immediate pressing issues we need to deal with. That's okay. Now, it does have to be voted upon by the members, right? This is not just a board decision. And another requirement here is that when that same association goes to resume their reserve funding after the 2-year pause, they will need to get a new SERS done in order to kind of update the funding plan, right? Because they took 2 years off. Now the financial picture has changed. They will need to go through and do a new engagement to find out what the new plan looks like. All right, still on this theme of financial relief, one of the biggest reasons we've always heard as an argument against the funding of reserves is that residents feel like the return on those funds, if they're sitting in the HOA or the condo's bank account, it's going to be pretty low compared to what they might be able to get investing the money on their own and just paying special assessments if they have to. Now, the problem with that argument is that when those owners have that money locked up in their own investment portfolios, they're not going to want to give it up, right? If they pass away or they move away, it's not like they bequeath some money back to the association, right? They're taking that with them. So this new language has been added to now allow boards to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more aggressive with how they invest their reserve funds, trying to get a better return for the association. So typically that money has always been sitting in very boring stuff like CD accounts or money market accounts that are just not getting very attractive returns compared to other investment options. So this new language in HB 913 was meant to allow associations to make quote unquote prudent investment decisions that hopefully will get a better return. This is still very new. We haven't really seen this adopted en masse by the market yet, but I'm hopeful that this does open up some new options for associations, right? I know that there are some financial advisors and banks who have now kind of run with this a little bit, trying to squeeze every bit of interest money that they can for their clients to try to defend against that argument about, keeping the money in the HOA's account or the condo's account versus their own personal accounts. All right, another thing that changed last year was this requirement for how often you need to update a SERS. So up until this point, the legislative requirement said that this plan has got to be updated at least every 10 years. But now there are some additional circumstances that would require an update to be performed if a couple other things transpire. Okay, so as I mentioned a few slides ago, if you've got a loan or a line of credit or a special assessment and you're using that as part of your funding plan, that's okay. But anytime you're going to do that, the SERS has to be updated to reflect that those funds are available, right? It's a totally new financial picture when you've got this outside money on the table. So anytime you're going to do that and incorporate that into your budget, you need to update your SERS. Now, this may be very relevant for properties, up to this point specifically, is that the SERS has to be updated before any budget is passed in which the funding of reserves does not align with the most recent SERS. Now, there's a lot of open question there about what does it mean to be in alignment with the SERS. We're still trying to hash that out as an industry, but the basic idea here is that if you have waived your reserve funding, if you've experienced a windfall, or if you've got some projects that got delayed or deferred, right? You're not in alignment with the assumptions that were in the prior one, then you need to do a new one, and you might want to do a new one because that might work out in your favor. If an insurance payout has replaced certain elements of the property for you and they've reset their physical lifespan, well, now you probably don't need to save as much money for those. Okay. So the point here is that it's anytime you're not in alignment with the plan, you've got to update the plan. I came up with this kind of silly example here to kind of explain that concept in a different way. Let's say that we're talking about how long it would take you to drive from Brickell to Jacksonville. Okay. Now, if I told you to leave at a specific time and to drive a certain speed, and we had a traffic forecast that showed us how much traffic there would be, we can reasonably predict when you would arrive. All right, we have a good plan for that. But let's say that you ignored the plan, you started a few hours late. Well, if that's the case, then now you are not in alignment with the original plan. You're not going to end up at the same place at the same time. And that means we've got to come up with a new plan based on the fact that you started later. Same goes for reserve money. If you wait a while, typically you have to do more to catch up after the fact. Okay, we've just got about 3 or 4 more slides here, so hang in there. If anybody's got any questions, you can start to populate those in the Q&A button. But a couple of final points to make here. One of the nice things in the bill last year is that they specifically defined this term baseline funding. Now, I did mention this earlier. This term has been in existence for quite a long time as part of our reserve study standards through CAI. So to me, this was just a nice way of making the language in Florida law consistent with our existing industry terminology. So if you're not familiar with what it means, baseline funding means that you're designing a funding plan that does the bare minimum, but makes sure that you that you never completely run out of money. Each year, as cash goes in and cash goes out of your reserve account, you have to make sure that you are at least staying above zero. That's what baseline funding means. The technical requirement here, the mathematical requirement in this case didn't change. It's just being called by the kind of industry adopted name. So nowadays you might see this popping up in your reserve study or in your SIRS. This is what baseline funding means. It's just been written into the statute. Okay, with regard to those reporting requirements that I talked about, there's only one significant change that took place in the last year. The first 2 things on the list were already in existence. As of last year, the new requirement was to, as of 2024, the requirement was to distribute a copy of the completed SIRS within 45 days of receiving it and also reporting that to the DBPR. The only additional thing that's now required is that an officer or a director must sign an affidavit acknowledging receipt of the SIRS. Now, this is something that, again, was signed into law July of last year, and there still is not a standardized affidavit form that has been adopted across the state. I was on a task force panel last fall that was working on that, and my understanding is that the standard form should be available here pretty soon, but that is not, to my knowledge, publicly available yet. So in the meantime, I would encourage you to talk to your lawyer, see if they can draft up a very basic 1-page affidavit, have a director sign it saying you received the SIRS, and you should be good. All right. Now I'm going to close with this because I think this is maybe the most important change that took place last year, and it didn't get a lot of coverage, but I want to highlight this for everybody out there. Okay, at the end of 2024, as we mentioned, the data provided by the DBPR showed that quite a few number, way less than half of the properties in the state had completed their SIRS. Maybe there's some good reasons for that, right? We can talk about the fact that there was initially a pretty short timeline and not very many providers who were available. Took the industry kind of a little bit of time to adapt and figure out how to do these. Of course, we saw the evolution of the legislation along the way, but they've kind of run out of patience here. So going forward, if you still have not gotten your SIRS done, the DBPR has been granted some expanded power to enforce compliance with this requirement. So it was already true, okay, up at the top here in this top box, it was already true that if an association was willfully and knowingly failing to meet the requirement, that the board of directors could have been found to be in breach of their fiduciary duties. Now, there's definitely some potential consequences to that. You can be dropped by your insurance carrier. It can be more difficult to obtain lending as a condo if you're not in compliance. That was already in the law. What's new now is this bottom part. Okay, the DBPR has now been given an additional authority to impose fines of up to $5,000, which in some cases could be charged individually to the board member, right? Not to the association. Aside from that, the individuals can also be removed from their position as a board member and prohibited from rejoining the board for a period of time. So again, this is something that kind of flew under the radar, and I'm not sure how well this is being promoted or enforced at this stage, but I want to just highlight for everybody that if you are in a board member position at a building that has not complied with the law, you could be facing a fine of up to $5,000. Okay, so for those of you who might be board members, or if you're advising board members out there, please pay attention to that. Make sure you're doing everything that you can to stay in compliance. Okay, my last comment here is just kind of how the psychology of all these requirements are now kind of circulating throughout the market. So to me, this was a long overdue process. This is kind of closing a loophole that existed in Florida law for a long time. It allowed the membership of associations to vote not to reserve money for things which are otherwise very routine and predictable. And we've seen many, many times over how that has played out. We've got a lot of buildings out there with little to no money set aside who have just constantly relied on loans or special assessments to get from one project to the next. And the major takeaway of Champlain Tower South was that kicking the can down the road and not physically or financially protecting your property is never going to be a good idea. Okay, so this is now the law of the land. There is a new normal. I think the real estate markets are kind of taking this all into account in real time. I'm sure everybody sees the same headlines as I do, talking about this, uncertainty in the market and what is this doing to condo prices and demand. We get all that. But this all, again, began with a tragedy, and the state is trying to do everything they can to prevent something like that from happening again. The last 2 points on this slide here, I think one of the biggest things that board members and managers can do is just to communicate with their residents to explain why this happened, the fact that they are not being singled out. This was not the board's failure. This is a new law that is spread across the state, and ultimately it's a good thing, but it might have a little bit of short-term pain for long-term gain, if you want to think of it that way. Of course, there are, I think, some positives here. If you have a healthy reserve fund, you will be less prone to those nasty special assessments and loans, which are going to drive the cost up anyways, right? So, some of the industry folks I've talked to over the last couple of years have asked, well, how does this change the financial reality for condos? And I think you could argue that if you zoom out far enough or on a long enough timeline, it actually doesn't change the out-of-pocket costs to the owners, right? It's just spreading it around, and hopefully making things more efficient, right? You're not playing these nasty games of musical chairs, just assuming or hoping that you will have enough money when you need it. Instead, everybody is paying their fair share of the cost of ownership of living in a building in real time. And the byproduct of doing that is that you're building up these cash balances and not exposed to those financial risks that you would otherwise be facing. So hopefully that's a little bit of a positive to end on. At this point, we'll go to you guys. I'll turn back on my camera. Abby, I don't know if you want to say anything else in closing. I haven't seen any other questions come up, but I'm here for you guys. So if there's anybody else who wanted to go over anything or circle back with any questions, now's the time.
No, but thank you for this amazing, really helpful program. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes, and we can circulate the presentation to those who want it, and also we can connect you so that everyone can get C credits. And if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you. Or if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Yeah, I just saw one from Raul asking for a link to the PowerPoint. Yes, so I'll send out probably a PDF copy of all the slides so that everything we covered today you can go through and read over again. And I'll also send out a copy of the House Bill 913 so that you guys can make reference to some of those changes we talked about today. Okay. If you got what you needed, you're free to go. I'll just say to everybody, thanks for the opportunity. Abby, thank you for putting this on, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again soon. Obviously, the laws may change again. There may yet be a special session this year, and if anything changes about the SERS requirements, we'll be here as a resource for everybody. So my email is there on the screen. I'll hang out for another couple of minutes or until everybody's departed, and you can also visit reservestudy.com. Our website's a great resource. You can request proposals straight through there and get a lot more content and articles and things of that nature. So
4 o'clock on the dot. Thank you, Will.
if nothing else, we were on time. So
Absolutely. That's hard to
right.
come by nowadays. Thank you so much. Well,
Cool.
thank you to our attendees, and we will circle back with each and every one of you.
Thanks so much. Talk to you next time. Thank you.